All right, well, welcome to the second Ocean Memory Seminar, titled The In-Between, the Memorialization of Blackness. Today there will be two seminars, first one by Kathy Foley-Meyer and second one by Jody Deming. Each will be 20 minutes long. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. There will be possibly be a short opportunity for questions between the two seminars, and we'll have, after the seminars are over, a discussion that will last until the half an hour. So if you're on the Eastern coast, that would be 8:30. Our first seminar speaker today is Kathy Foley-Meyer. Kathy Foley-Meyer is a mixed media artist, arts consultant, and PhD candidate in visual studies at University of California, Irvine. Her work is inspired by the history of the African diaspora and explores themes of interconnectedness, memory, visibility, and transparency. She received her Master of Fine Arts in the writing program in critical studies from California Institute of the Arts. As an arts consultant, she worked on a corporate social responsibility program for a company in the global finance sector and also provided services to local arts organizations serving Black communities in Los Angeles. She served on the board of the Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions from 2011 to 2019, with the last 3 years as chair. She also served on the board of the Museum of Neon Art from 2005 to 2012. She was part of the art selection and advisory committees for Metro Art for the Los Angeles Expo Metro Rail Line and has served on grant panels for the Los Angeles County Arts Commission. Our second speaker today will be Jody Deming. Jody Deming is an oceanographer who, with her students, explores microbial life in the Arctic Ocean and its sea ice cover, including how microbes have adapted to the cold and their broader ecological roles. These interests build on prior years of research on microbial adaptation to the deep sea. At the University of Washington in Seattle, she has directed the Marine Bioremediation Program, launched what has become the Center for Environmental Genomics, and helped establish the nation's first graduate training program in astrobiology. She serves on numerous international committees and is editor-in-chief of the ocean science domain of the nonprofit open access journal Elementa, Science of the Anthropocene. She is a member of the American Academy of Microbiology and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. As a former pianist and lover of the arts, she is devoted to developing ocean memory as an inspiring line of inquiry at the interfaces of manifold disciplines and practices. With that, I give the floor to Kathy Foley-Meyer. We look forward to both of your presentations.
So first off, I would like to thank Jody. We've had some really nice and illuminating conversations about Blackness in the ocean. And I also wanted to say thank you to the ocean memory community for inviting me to join on this voyage of discovery. So today I'm going to show examples of my artwork and attempt to describe how they correlate with the concept of ocean memory and the concept of the in-between as it relates to the lived experience of Blackness. So what do we mean by in-between? And I alluded to it a little in my lightning talk back in June when I equated Blackness with fugitivity, adaptability, and transformation. I think of the in-between as being in flux, where the flux is the norm, literally a fluid norm. There are elements of these three concepts in the lives of all Black people in the United States and elsewhere, and these three states of being are as present today as they were when we got here. Keep these three terms in mind as we proceed through the slides: fugitivity, adaptability, and transformation. As I've noted previously, the focus of my research and my artwork is not what happened to our ancestors upon arrival in the New World. I'm focused on our ancestors whose bodies were committed to the sea in transit. Throughout this presentation, you will see examples of my artwork where I first began to work with the concept of ocean memory. So to talk about that, I'm going to start with the database slavevoyages.org. My artistic journey began here. I was confronted with an overwhelming mass of data, as well as the equally overwhelming amount of data that cannot be accumulated. The unknown unknowns, who was thrown overboard and how and where and when did it happen. In this particular page, I was searching for Voyages of the Jolly Batchelor, which was a slaver that transported slaves to the East Coast of the United States, and it figures in an artwork that I created later that you'll see an example of. So there are no answers to the questions on the slide. We'll never know the names of the people that were thrown overboard, and we'll never know for sure the circumstances of their being deposited into the sea. So we're basically left with the numbers, like the ones on this page, which are both specific and inadequate for the task of hand, which is the task of knowing. So in my artistic process, I am guided by the words of Miles Davis: don't play what's there, play what's not there. He counseled his fellow musicians to look for and play the notes that are not contained in the printed pages of music. Play the notes that you hear in your head. In the same way, I'm constructing the territories of loss of Black lives that transcend linear time. I know these human beings existed. We have records of them from their embarkment. From that point, we can say that they've passed into, as Edouard Glissant would say, an abyss, which is not only an ending, the end of a human being's life as a resident of the continent of Africa, but also a beginning. Those lost during the Middle Passage achieved an abyssal beginning in the life cycle of the ocean, and those that survived the voyage have an abyssal beginning as well as progenitors of Black lives in the West. So when I was confronted with the conundrum of how do I represent absence, I chose numbers from the transatlantic slave trade database. And so this represents one of the voyages of the Jolly Batchelor. The numbers in white are dates of departure. Also, the number of slaves that are human beings that they disembarked with from the continent, and the number of days spent in Middle Passage, and then the number that arrived in the New World. And so the number in black is the number of lives lost during the voyage. In her seminal work, In the Wake on Blackness and Being, the scholar Christina Sharp discusses the concept of resonance time, the amount of time it takes for a substance to enter the ocean and then leave it, i.e. be fully consumed by it. She writes, human blood is salty and sodium has a residence time of 260 million years. And I think it's also always worth noting, and actually the number here is incorrect, it's actually more than 1 million. The African continent is the only territory to have more than 1 million of its millions of its former inhabitants consigned to the ocean depths over the course of 400 years, the approximate length of the transatlantic slave trade. It is a global distribution that cannot and will not be repeated in any circumstance. And it's possible to conceive of the multitudes of Black lives in residence time as blackness without boundary, a generative and regenerative state of being, a narrative of blackness that, while initiated in violence, has also transcended it. And Fair American is another panel from 12 Voyages. And you'll see the full work at the end of the presentation. So if we do the math, that's millions of lives spooling into their 260 million year residence time temporalities of existence over 400 years of linear time. Those Africans thrown into the sea have achieved in-between status. They've experienced corporeal death, but their existence continues as part of the life cycle of the ocean. They will outlive us in our linear time on Earth as human beings. Their life cycle is in concert with that of the planet. They are still our ancestors, even though they never set foot in the New World. So one of the meanings of at sea, the phrase at sea, is to be unable to decide, a state of confusion, the state of in-between in one's mind. Being at sea in one's mind evokes a sense of loss, the loss of the sure path forward. Existing in residence time can be thought of as a state of corporeal confusion, subject to the whims of the currents, on the surface at first and then descending to the bottom, but also moving in a direction set by the current and coming into contact with sea life. In the psychic hold of Slavery, Legacies in American Expressive Culture, Calvin Warren describes Black time as the non-static nature of Black temporality, and describes slavery as, quote, an event horizon in which the horizon of violence fractures the vectors of temporality. The human cargo discharged from the ship suffers what Edouard Glissant labels a glittering death, while at the same time entering Black time and residence time, an existence that defies conventional methods of memorialization. So Black time is a temporality circumscribed by violence and erasure. Black time and residence time for the Black lives of the Middle Passage are unconquerable in that both exceed the time frame of reference that we, as human beings existing in the present, use when we speak of our desire to move beyond the past. A little over a decade ago in the US, the idea was floated in the public discourse that we were post-racial. The events of our current calendar year alone dictate that we regard that post-state as wishful thinking. The exhibition of J.M.W. Turner's Slave Ship, the image on the left, was accompanied by a poem the artist had written in 1812, in which he chastised both those who would trade in human cargo. And it is generally assumed that the painting was influenced by the court case of the Zong, in which the owners of the ship sued the maritime insurers after the vessel threw more than 130 of their human cargo overboard when the ship became lost and short of provisions en route to Jamaica. Entitled Fallacies of Hope, the poem reads, "Aloft all hands, strike the topmasts and belay. Yon angry setting sun and fierce-edged clouds declare the typhoon's coming. Before it sweeps your decks, throw overboard the dead and dying. Ne'er heed their chains. Hope, hope, fallacious hope, where is thy market now?" In his book, The Zong, A Massacre, the Law, and the End of Slavery, James Walvin describes Liverpool, the city where the Zong's notorious voyage originated, as, quote, the city built on slavery. Truthfully, there are many such cities dispersed throughout the West, including our nation's capital. What happened aboard the Zong was a common occurrence, as is what's depicted in the image on the right, a lithograph of a voyage of the Jolly Batchelor. And you'll recall, there's a panel earlier in this presentation that I did of the Jolly Batchelor. Shipboard rebellions were also a feature of the trade in human lives, and that's what's being depicted in this lithograph, is a revolt. The 1743 attack on this slaver was unusual in that it was carried out by native Guineans who boarded the ship from where it was docked and in the process of loading human cargo in the Sierra Leone River. They killed the captain and 2 crew members and freed the captives in the hold. So Vicissitudes is an underwater sculpture by Jason DeCaires Taylor. Oh, just realized that I'm showing you the wrong one, but sorry. Achieved viral status on the internet shortly after it was installed in 2012, when it was believed to be a tribute to lives lost during the Middle Passage. So the online discussion regarding vicissitudes was sparked in part by a website, America's Black Holocaust Museum, the motto of which is bringing our history to light. Once it was revealed that Taylor did not, in fact, intend it to be a commemoration of lives lost during the Middle Passage, the site corrected its original entries by crossing them out rather than removing them. In this fashion, the installation serves as a counter-monument to those lost lives. Their absence is marked by the presence of text that is canceled but still legible. By counter-monument, I'm referring to the practice of consciously intervening in the traditional or stated meaning of a monument. Displaying the text in this manner can also be regarded as a pushback against invisibility in the larger discourse on the transatlantic slave trade. The comment section of the website reveals the psychic need for a commemoration of lives lost during the Middle Passage, and the decision by at least one person to continue to think of vicissitudes as a Middle Passage memorial demonstrates the power of the counter-monument. The ABHM website features a GIF that begins as a black background and gradually changes to a film of the sun emerging from clouds. Because so much of the history involving Black Americans is missing, distorted, or refashioned to suit the moral positioning of the colonial powers in the West, the pushback often takes the form of an internet site such as this that is shared within and outside of the Black community, a community that has been long engaged in this conversation. So keeping in mind fugitivity, adaptability, and transformation. So Jason DeCaires Taylor says of vicissitudes, quote, "The sculpture proposes growth, change, and natural transformation. It shows how time and environment impact on and shape the physical body. Children by nature are adapted to their surroundings. Their use within the work highlights the importance of creating a sustainable and well-managed environment, a space for future generations." Taylor's words contain shades of meaning on multiple levels. In his initial denial of the middle past memorialization, one could interpret his use of Black people as models in his sculpture as a kind of unintended reinscription of colonization from the Earth's surface to the bottom of the sea. Representation is a fraught territory. The fact that an artist could conceive of putting renderings of Black bodies on the ocean floor without considering the Middle Passage, particularly in Grenada, where it has been noted the population is largely descended from slaves, strikes this artist as a particular kind of willful blindness and ultimately a refusal of Blackness. It is my contention that there are no uncontested spaces in which Blackness and Black people can exist, and the public discourse surrounding vicissitudes is a perfect illustration of that principle. So in 2018, there was the announcement of the discovery of Autolykiviridae, a new family of non-tailed dsDNA viruses off the coast of Massachusetts. And the researchers also discovered that, Autolykiviridae may be related to viral sequences in the human gut microbiome. So Autolykiviridae takes its name from the Greek myth surrounding Autolycus, a thief who possessed the power to change the appearance of objects he had stolen, from white to black, for example. Autolycus is a trickster, quote, difficult to catch, which translates into difficult to see, an issue of visibility, much like the millions of Africans now in residence time in the Atlantic. So the concept of ocean memory allows us to consider a microbial Blackness as being present in the ocean. As human beings, we come from the sea, and those lost during the Middle Passage have been returned to our point of origin. The public discourse around those lost during the Middle Passage is shifting towards recognition. At the recent Deep Sea Biology Society conference in August of this year, Philip Turner of Duke University moderated a panel entitled "Commemorating the Middle Passage on the Atlantic Seabed in the Area Beyond Jurisdiction," which advocated recognition and memorialization of those Africans for which, quote, the Atlantic seabed became their final resting place, by the International Seabed Authority, the governing body for mineral rights in the areas beyond jurisdiction. The panel's suggestion of virtual ribbons marking major slave trade routes across the Atlantic on ISA maps is one such possibility for memorialization, and I'm sure there will be others. So in-between status is derived from lack of recognition of the human, treated as cargo, treated as energy for Western democracies provided by labor, codified as 3/5 of a man. The bodies of human beings thrown overboard are in residence time, while the shackles that held their flesh and eventually their bones are on the seafloor, markers and the detritus of cruelty. So when I first began to think about this particular piece, I was trying to portray the shackles, actually, and realized that I didn't want to represent the metal that held the limbs, but rather the limbs themselves. And then finally, this is a photo of 12 voyages. 12 voyages that I selected from the transatlantic slave trade database and made 12 individual paintings. Actually, technically, there are 13 voyages because one ship down here has two. But in 2017, I exhibited this piece in Japan as part of a group exhibition of American and Japanese artists in Tokyo. 12 Voyages resonated in Japan in a way that surprised me at first, but then made sense the longer I was there. The Japanese are in touch with their ancestors in a way that is different from that of the US, and they understood immediately that the numbers represented the presence of an absence. I close by saying that if we think of ocean memory as a process, then contained within it is an entire population of Black lives that are no less meaningful from having been cut short during a voyage across the Atlantic. Though invisible to the naked eye, they are actively engaged in their own millions of processes in the life cycle of the ocean. Thank you very much.
All right, so our next speaker will be Jody Deming. Jody, the floor is yours.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this subject and seminar. And thank you so much to Kathy for educating me beyond where I was, which was ground zero. You will see that this is a personal journey for me. So I just ask you to keep that in mind. At the time of the slave trade, the science of oceanography did not exist. We did not know anything about this Atlantic Ocean except what we could see at the surface, what sailors could see at the surface. But at the time, people imagined what they could see. They imagined if they could draw the water off the Atlantic and expose the seafloor, that it would present a scene most rugged, grand, and imposing, and that this would be spectacular. Well, today we can do that. And this is a video provided by NASA that shows you in white arrows the surface currents of the ocean. So you see over here coming from Africa, the trade currents that come over to the Caribbean, take the Gulf Stream north into the North Atlantic, where the waters get colder and saltier, they become denser, and so they sink. And you're seeing those waters sink and now flow underneath the surface currents, flow through the deep sea, through that rugged seafloor that you can now envision here in this model simulation. And these deep water currents now flow more or less a similar pathway through the North Atlantic down into the South Atlantic, coming full circle to the South Atlantic. Well, I want to say that the residence time of the water itself to make this transit from Africa up around the Gulf Stream to the North Atlantic and back down here is on average 325 years. So multiple centuries, the same time frame as the Atlantic slave trade. So I would suggest to you that whatever is in the water itself, dissolved and moving with the water itself, is still in the Atlantic Ocean. I'm bringing forward this quote from T.S. Eliot, not to use the word exploration as exploitation and colonialization and all the negative terms that we can ascribe to it, but as a personal exploration. Because delving into this subject matter has been so personal for me, as you'll see, that it has taken a circling back around my life to see and know the place for the first time. This is a more classic bathymetric view of the Atlantic Ocean. The dark blue shows you the deepest basins in the Atlantic. The Puerto Rico Trench is over here, the very deepest part. And the next slide shows you the first 20 years of my time as a research oceanographer. I started working off the coast. Actually, I started working off the coast of Florida, but then my first major expeditions were off the coast of Africa, and then off the coast of Brazil, and off the coast of the Puerto Rico and the Caribbean islands here, and then along the continental shelves and deep abyssal plains off of our own coast here, and back to the Bay of Biscay, returning to Europe here. Without knowing it at the time, without ever thinking about it, I was researching the Atlantic slave trade route, which is shown here. This comes from the site that Kathy referred to, slavevoyages.org. If you've never been to it, you must go to it. I'm bringing forward things that an oceanographer would bring forward probably in terms of maps, but that's the way I'm thinking here. Kathy brought forward different aspects of it. But here you see the captives were obtained from Middle Africa, took the trade winds, the currents over to the Caribbean, of course, also to Brazil, around our coast here, and back to Europe. When the vessels were emptied over here of their human cargo, they were refilled with raw goods from the Americas, from the New World. And those ships took the raw goods back to Britain, basically, back to Europe, where they entered the manufacturing realm of Europe. And manufactured goods were put on those ships, sent back down to Africa to purchase slaves. And so you had this triangular slave trade going on continuously for nearly 400 years. These are my research sites imposed on this slave trade. I'm bringing forward next a series of maps from that website to give you a sense of the scale of this operation. So what you see here is the time scale here from the early 1500s to the end of the 1800s, and the accumulated captives that were embarked. These are the countries involved. It was not a single country. It was not single individuals. They were trading companies doing this work. It began with few ships, Denmark and Portugal leading the way. By 1600, it was a robust effort. You can see the Portuguese and the Danes are, each of these points represents a sailing vessel. And you see a new player coming into view, Great Britain in the red. 100 years later, in 1700, the Britons are dominating this trade, although you see the Portuguese are still, and the Portuguese are continuously through these 400 years, feeding Brazil, if you will. There are also some new players here. France is coming into view. The Netherlands are players. And what would become the USA is involved. In the midst of our Revolutionary War for independence from Britain, both Britain and France are fully involved, very robust. As we are declaring our independence, the trade is very robust. In the midst of the French Revolution, where they are fighting for relief from their oppression, the trade is very robust. In 1807, our US Congress, as well as Great Britain, voted to ban the slave trade, just not slavery itself. It took a lag period of 5 years before it stopped for those two countries. And you see that here 2 years later, after it has been declared illegal, major US activity of delivering African captives to our country, major British activities delivering to the Caribbean still. Portuguese continuously delivering to South America. By 1812, Great Britain and the US were out of this for the most part. There were some rogue, I call them rogue American ships still involved because it was illegal for them to be involved. The Brits were out and Spain was now replacing their activities. Portugal continued. still a very robust activity. By 1860, we fought a war over this, but look at the US activity, no longer delivering slaves to the mainland of North America, but very active. And if I didn't mention this before, the size of the dot is scaled to the number of Africans enslaved on board. So we were very involved in this activity. 5 years later, slavery was abolished by Lincoln, and this is the last of the graphs on that website. They disappear to zero. There were continuing rogue vessels through the rest of this century. So during this period, as Kathy has indicated, at least 1 million Africans, and I've seen estimates as high as 4 million. The data are hard to come by, except that it's the difference between the numbers embarked and the numbers disembarked, and evidence of rebellions and various things. This many were sacrificed at sea, shall we use the word sacrificed. So what could we know about their physical fate at the time? This is 1865, when the bulk of it is trying to end. So now some history, a little bit of history on scientific exploration of the deep sea. At the time, we didn't have a science of oceanography. In 1842, we had the theory, the abyssus theory, or the azoic theory, that no life existed in the deep sea. Edward Forbes was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. It took some years, but the famous expedition on the British Challenger, a 4-year expedition, the first one ever dedicated to science of the ocean, it plumbed the depths of the global ocean almost to the greatest depths, which was quite a feat in that time period, and recovered countless new animal species clearly adapted to the deep sea. So this threw out the idea that the deep ocean was lifeless. But these creatures were visible creatures. You could handle them shipboard. What about the invisible microbial world, the world that today we know dominates the ocean numerically? They are invisible to us, but they are doing all of the work of recycling materials that enter the ocean, returning them to nutrients and fueling the whole ocean ecosystem. Well, the first to ask the question, do bacteria inhabit the ocean, much less is organic matter subject to decomposition, came from 2 French microbiologists in the 1880s, Certes and Regnard. And the Ocean Memory Project's own Tony Adler has written a book on bringing Pasteur's science to the sea, because these 2 guys studied with Louis Pasteur, who was famous, of course, for documenting disease-causing bacteria and developing methods for growing them in the lab and proving their existence. And so these 2 scientists were able to answer the questions. Yes, there are bacteria in the ocean, but they had no means, no methods to answer the second question. They could only say possibly. They were still working on a sailing vessel with no refrigeration, nothing modern to address this question. Then it turns out there was a long hiatus, possibly 100 years, with very limited microbial work in the deep sea. Some important work was done, but very limited. It wasn't until the 1970s when we had an absolute explosion of new tools and methodologies, ways to sample the deep sea, but also ways to see the invisible microbes, to begin to sequence their DNA, but even just to see them under the microscope properly. And so there was a lot of interest and effort in the deep sea in that decade and the next 2. I was a graduate student in the 70s, and I entered this world at this realm of science at that point. The discovery of hydrothermal vent communities at the end of this decade, entirely supported by deep sea bacteria, put to rest any idea that bacteria are not active in the deep ocean, which was still the prevailing view at the beginning of this decade. But by the end of it, we know that the deep ocean is fully active with microbes. So what about the fate of those million Africans taken from their homeland but never arriving the Americas, the in-between that Kathy has more eloquently talked about with her words, which are, I'm trying to learn, but I'm still a poor scientist. In the 100 years between the end of the slave trade and what I would call modern microbial oceanography, we didn't know how to think about the fate of a human body in the ocean, just what we could see in the surface, predator attacks, as Turner captured in that painting of 1840, and what we would expect to happen if you're shackled. You would descend to the seafloor. And there are cases, Kathy tells me, of recovering shackles from the seafloor. Well, what do we know now about microbial activity in the cold, deep ocean, and particularly in the deep Atlantic Ocean? And this is where I go on my personal voyage with you, brief as it's going to be, to show you just a little bit of what I learned at a time when I wasn't even thinking about the Middle Passage. I'll start here in the Angola Basin. We had new methodology, new equipment for pulling up parcels of seawater entirely under pressure, so undecompressed and cold, and we could add radioactive tracers into this parcel of seawater, and we could make measurements of activity. All I want you to see is that the activity was positive. Every experiment we did on these deep sea microbes in the water showed they were active. They're actively metabolizing and recycling. We also deployed baited traps to the bottom of the seafloor. This was the new thing to do of that decade if you were interested in any animals down below. So you could recover the amphipods of the deep sea, the scavengers they're called, that would be attracted to any bait in the trap. And I was the microbiologist that would dissect them and examine their guts and discover these simple but elegant, in my mind, microorganisms, the yellow DNA staining organisms here, clearly growing, happily dividing, feeding off of the detrital organic material that's inside the guts of these scavengers. And they're doing this all under very high pressure and low temperature of the deep sea. So we knew they were active in the water itself. We knew they were active in the guts of deep sea scavengers. What about all particulate matter that rains down through the ocean and ends up accumulating on the seafloor? Well, today we have all manner of methodology for collecting this mass of sinking particles. But in the 70s, 79, I believe, is the first publication of a sediment trap, they're called. And it was my privilege to get access to the first sediment traps moored on the deep sea floor and examine them for microbial activity. Here comes a sediment trap being recovered from off the coast of Africa. Here's the collection cup under the sediment trap, which I'm blowing up for you to show that little bit of particulate material that we've managed to trap. But then under the microscope, you can see all the orange organic matter and the yellow staining microorganisms that are colonizing all this material and, again, doing the degradative, decomposing activity that they are famous for. To the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean, which underlies the trade route. You can see Florida off in the distance here, all of the Caribbean islands along here. For 400 years, Africans were transported along this pathway. We don't know where they left the vessel, those that didn't make it to land, but we can imagine that some are here. This is the deepest part of the Atlantic. And from the bottom of this trench, Pasteur style, I isolated this organism. Again, very simple bacterium, but it was a brand new genus. I named it after my advisor because she had made everything possible for me to be doing any of this research. This was an absolutely remarkable organism at the time because it only grew if you gave it very high pressures, the high pressures at the bottom of the Puerto Rico Trench and the cold temperatures there. If you brought it up into the water column, if you even brought it to 200 atmosphere pressure, which is the equivalent of 2,000 meters depth, if you just brought it up out of the trench into the ocean, it would die. So this was an example of an organism, a microorganism, that was obligately obliged to live at the bottom of that trench. So this was proof positive that there are unique deep sea, even hadal organisms working at the bottom of the ocean. In hindsight, in full circle, many decades later, I would name this new species, I would give it an African name as a form of memorialization. In this trench, sedimenting material accumulates. It accumulates all across the seafloor, of course, but the trench is ultimately destined to subduct. And any material that is left in the sediments here that has not been recycled back into the ocean, it's a very small percentage that gets left, but that percentage is destined to subduct and become part of the planet's memory. So I wish to suggest that the lost African ancestors from the trade, the slave trade business, are memorialized not simply in the ocean, but in the vital cycles of the ocean. The descending material that gets recycled as it descends, recycled at the seafloor, returning nutrients that drive the entire ecosystem of the ocean, that keep the ocean healthy, that keep the planet healthy, memorializes Blackness. Ultimately, the destination is over a much longer time scale to become the planet. In the meantime, if my voice doesn't give, we can look at the time scale just beyond residence time in the Atlantic. So here we are 200 years into the ocean from Africa, descending back to return to the South Atlantic. And when we reach the South Atlantic, we will be at the end of the 4 centuries of the slave trade. So the ancestors are still in the ocean today. But what happens beyond this point? At this point, the currents enter the global thermohaline circulation pathway, as it's called. You'll see that some of the currents eventually do come back to Africa, but it's going to take 1,000 to 3,000 years now to circle the planet along with the global circulation. But the next destiny of Black ancestors in the ocean will be the global ocean, memorializing it. Thank you for taking this journey with me. That's it.
Thank you so much. I wanted to pause there before saying anything, just to let that sink in. Yeah, there's comments about how powerful it was and how amazing and wonderful. I had a couple notes to maybe prompt conversation. One of the things I wrote down was it really seems like Kathy is an artist with the heart of a scientist, and Jody, you know, a scientist with the heart of an artist. You two really brought together two very different talks that fit together very well and told this coherent story. There's a question there are some questions. First, how much would you two like to talk about your process of working this conversation together? I know you could probably talk a long time, and we talked about a little bit before we started, but maybe just a couple words from Kathy and then Jody about bringing this together for the wider group to hear.
Sure. So we had a couple of Zoom calls, and over the course of our conversations, it came out that I was talking about how I'd visited Africa a few times, and then she explained to me how she, in the course of her work in the late 70s and mid-late 80s, had actually been to the continent, but hadn't really been thinking about the slave trade. So I thought, okay, well, you're revisiting a journey that you've had before, and it's sort of normal, not in a way. The slave trade it's something that's always there under the surface, but it's not as if we don't celebrate it in our history the same way we do, Thanksgiving, which is upon us. But I was really intrigued by Jody's process, actually, of self-discovery, observing her, thinking about our past journeys. And then, because that's all I'm doing is thinking about past journeys. Of course, they're not journeys that I was on, obviously, but it was a very natural, organic process. And I'm really grateful that we were able, that I was able to present with her, actually, because it made it more meaningful to me that she was finding more different meanings in her journey, if that makes sense.
And my journey would not have found that different meaning without Kathy pointing the way to new knowledge and new information. I have been reading as much as I can under circumstances and educating myself as much as I can. We only had, I think, 3 Zooms together. So our exchanges were not voluminous, but each one took me very far further in the journey. And lots of memories came flooding back. I mean, after my cruise to the Angola and Cape basins, we docked in Cape Town, and this was in the 70s, remember, during apartheid. And I was fully ill from what I observed and had to return to the ship. Yet I still did not make the connection to the slave trade. So I had experiences in Africa, but I did not make the connection. It wasn't until talking with Kathy and reading the information she gave me that I began to make the connection. So this is the essence of the Ocean Memory Project, where you bring people with different perspectives together and they discover new things about themselves and about the world. And thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, I was just going to say really quickly, I shared with Jody, I forgot when she asked me the first time, but I shared with her not only images of my artwork, but a chapter from Christina Sharp's book, In the Wake on Blackness and Being. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that. And then I shared an article about counter-monumentality from a group of German researchers. And I can get all the links for those and share them with you all as well.
Thank you. We had a couple comments and questions. Rika, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. I was just wondering if either of you, and Kathy especially, if you've read The Deep by Rivers Solomon, which reminds me a lot of what you were talking about. It's a novel that's based on a song by Debbie Diggs' group. Debbie Diggs is in Hamilton fame. And I think that's based on a really old song or fable about the descendants of African women who who had been put overboard during the Middle Passage and how they were still living in the deep sea. And it's a book all about memory and how you need to remember their past in order to move forward with the future. And so everything you were saying reminded me of that book. And I'm wondering if you've read it or if you're familiar with that and how you've thought about it in dialogue with your own work, if you are.
I haven't read that book. I am reading a book now called Deep, which is written by a guy who observed that kind of diving where you just go as far as you can without equipment. I can't remember the name for that. But no, I have not read that book, so I will add it to my reading list for sure. Thank you. But I have heard of the song, yeah.
Stefan had a really interesting comment. If Stefan's still here, it's long. I don't want to summarize it, but very interesting. Yes, no.
I'm here. I'm happy for people to just read it. But I just picked a book up off of my shelf because I'm stuck here with my books. But this is, I don't know if anybody's read this.
No, I haven't.
This is a really interesting kind of reading of histories of geology through histories of racialization and the racialization of rocks and bodies and the kind of, conspiracy between histories of mining and histories of exploitation. It's very much about histories of mining and geology and not about the ocean. So it would be interesting to think about transporting some of the stories that Catherine Yusof tells in this book to an oceanic context. Have you read this, Anya? Do you know this?
I have not.
Have you read it, Kathy? Or you know about it?
Sorry, I'm reading it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's all. I'm just trailing. This is so great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've never heard of that book. I'm really interested in that. Your talks, I've talked to Kathy about her work before, which has just been super inspiring for me because she used sort of the same terminology as oceanographers use, residence time. And then Jody brought in a lot of the way oceanographers think: Atlantic overturning circulation, geochemistry, marine biogeochemistry, and the one of the thoughts I had that was really just smashed me in the head was I think about organic matter degradation in the ocean daily, and putting a human life in that as part of the organic matter is so disturbing a thought, but it's a necessary thought. And I was wondering, I don't know, there's science to be pursued there that probably has been pursued. But I just was, it's just very impactful presentation by both of you. And I'm sure we've recorded this, and I think it should be shared widely if everyone agrees to it. Any other questions, comments? Oh, we have a question from Daniel. How do we think about memory, memorializing, and science together?
That's all I've been thinking about in preparing this talk, and I had hoped that our talks together would answer that question. So I would throw the question back to Daniel. How are you now thinking about memory, memorializing, and science together?
I haven't until the second, so I'm trying to fathom the depth of that echo. I feel like these encounters open up these echoes between different realms that don't necessarily usually talk to each other. And so how do you do science and memorialize? In memorials, there's this deep sense of respect and honor, which I don't associate with the scientific practice, but maybe actually it's there in a different form. I don't know. I'm neither a scientist nor a.
Well, we have many forms of offering respect and memorializing. We just haven't adopted them to memorialize Africans. For example, we name our expeditions, we name our ships over the people we honor and respect. We name our organisms, the genus and the species, after the people we honor and respect. We have numerous ways of memorializing. The new way for me, though, was to think about how the microorganisms themselves memorialize the lost Africans. They themselves, in their activities and their continuity through time, through all the history of the ocean, of the planet's ocean, its 4 billion year history, it's the microbes that are doing all the memorializing. And they're still doing that work, and they're doing it for the lost Africans too. But to think of a living organism that we can't even see with our eyes as doing the memorializing is a new way of thinking for me.
Yeah, it's that third word that Daniel added there, right? As a group, we've been thinking about memory and science for years now, since how many years now? 3-4 years. But the memorialization or memorializing is the new word, I think, for me. You're right, Jody, that we have been doing this as a group for over the whole entire history of oceanography, but actually thinking about it in this sort of in a different way, like as Julie Huber wrote, I see an intersection with colonial science / parachute science as well. Julie, did you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, there was a question, sorry, I'm like in my pajamas in my kitchen, so I'm not turning on my camera. Thinking about whether or not, oceanographers in the field broadly think about some of the things that we just heard Jody and Kathy speak about. And, oceanographers, for most of the field's development, really just go into other countries, do what they want and leave, which has a lot of parallels to the slave trade. And as a field, we've been thinking about that and thinking about how we can do better and how we can change that narrative a bit. But it's really challenging. But as Jody said, you go to all these places and they're named after Spanish explorers or, things like that. And with no regard to indigenous people and things like that. And so it is something we're thinking about, but it sort of just struck a chord with me.
I would say that the term memorialization was a new term for me. And with one of the parts of the process that Kathy and I went through was developing a title. And if the title for this talk would encompass both of our talks or if we would have separate titles. And we went through a number of words and we converged on the title we came up with. But I had to learn some new words.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the process of art making is a lot like the process of the scientific process in that you're kind of on a trajectory of recognition. So, and obviously it's hard to recognize something you can't even see, which is what intrigued me about the discovery of the new DNA. And that was the connection I made, in my own work. This type of DNA was difficult to see, but it was finally seen. And I feel the same way about the microbial presence of blackness in the ocean. It's difficult to see, but we're now starting to recognize it. And to Anne's comment, I would love to see that type of, she writes, I'm curious how people on this call think the field of oceanography or other fields of science would change if the understanding Jody was able to experience in dialogue with Kathy was embedded into graduate education and leadership development. I think that would be a beautiful thing.
So I'm teaching a course on ocean memory right now, and I have undergrads and grads in it. And I gave this talk as a trial run this morning to them for their input. And they gave me terrific input. And it was also extremely clear that this was the best subject they'd heard all fall. They are hungry to hear this sort of thing. So I think there is an audience for this, a need for it.
Yeah, I'm seeing a paper that can be written up, a study that can be done, and a paper that can be written up. I'm seeing it in front of me right now.
Oh, good. You're going to write it, or do I have to put it on my list?
First, I got to write the code or get somebody to write the code for me, and then I'll write it.
Kathy's going to write it.
Lisa has an interesting comment. Lisa, do you want to jump in here?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I just started thinking about, like, does a memorial have to be static? And, you know, living in the Gulf South and in New Orleans, you know, you're always hearing, like, is the Louisiana 100-year coastal master plan, which is trying to heal these wetlands and rebuild land that has been lost because of coastal erosion and also oil exploration, is that a kind of memorial that has, and that plan was developed by scientists? You know, like I feel like when you live in Louisiana, this intersection of a memorial and science is kind of always right there in front of you. So I was just thinking about that. I don't really have an answer. But when you were talking about the intersection of science and memorials, that's what came to mind.
That's what we do here at Ocean Memory. We're supposed to inspire new ideas. Any other comments, questions? I have some.
I have a comment that's a little bit off topic, but not very far, because I read a lot to prepare for this, and ran across so many interesting aspects of those slave ships. And one that made me think of the Ocean Memory Project so much is how they lost their spoken language and had to communicate by other sounds, by vibrations and various ways they could make sounds through the barriers that they lived in on the ship to try to communicate with each other. And they were already adopting a major form of communication in the ocean, which is sound, and which many people on this screen are playing with right now, seriously playing with it. And there's a whole realm of investigation that could be made here on sound and the human use of sound underwater.
Anyone else want to step up?
Max has something.
Do you?
Yeah, I do. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Sorry for I've been a little quiet, but I've been paying attention. Jody's note about sound is interesting to me because where I come from, or where I was born, Haiti, Creole as a language is very onomatopoeic. So when you talk, like there are like quite a few words in the language that essentially the word is what the sound is. And that was just a curious thought. But the question that I really like listening to all of this that I've been really curious about is like, what are the sort of, I'm just interested in what the sort of like concrete, sort of like, not necessarily concrete, but like what are the scientific implications of, that sort of like lost biomass? I think Kathy talked on it in her presentation, where she referred to it as the unanswerable questions. But I've always been under the impression that, some of the best science gets done when you try to answer the unanswerable questions in a like compelling way. So like listening, thinking about, again, I can't, again, 1 to 4 million people and that large biomass, and how it, sort of how Jody pointed out, how if it were to end up in the ocean, that biomass would have floated around the ocean, not just in one singular spot, but maybe would have floated for like 300 years all around the ocean and is still moving and is still mobile. And like what science can we parse out from that? Because when it's a massive study. Like, it's just to say, like, we don't have very many, or to my knowledge, we don't have very many like examples of that. Like, you have a human effect on the planet at that size that is like totally unresearched.
So I'd like to address 2 points there. First, a correction of perception. When I talked about the residence time of several centuries of material in the water, that's dissolved material. So a body would have to be decomposed to its dissolved components to still be traveling in the water. Most of the body the residue of the body would be in the sediments at the seafloor. And even there, it would be recycled over time. I'm amazed I can talk about this because not too many days ago, I couldn't talk about the degradation of a human body in the ocean. When like you, Max, when I thought about these millions of bodies degrading in the ocean, it's like, whoa. So I did the scientific thing to try to calm myself down. I calculated the amount of carbon in a body of such and such weight times the million. I did that calculation, compared that to the North Atlantic bloom of phytoplankton, the natural forms of carbon that get fixed in the ocean. And though to us as human beings, those millions of bodies are huge and unconscionable losses, they're negligible to what the ocean itself produces. So it's less than 0.001% of what the ocean itself produces through photosynthesis during that same period of time. What's extraordinary is that we had so many bodies in the water in a concentrated period of time and place. And I wish we knew the places. We don't know the places, so we can't do the scientific thing and figure this out better. We're stuck in the in-between, if you will, between art and science, of how to imagine where they are.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I remember when we first started, Jody, you were very concerned with the number of bodies and and I was trying to figure out a way to help you. I don't want to say not let go of it, because it's not like you're forgetting the humanity, but you almost have to mimic them. You have to become fluid in your thinking. And what we tend to do is we want to trace. We're always looking for that point of origin. It's like a normal human thing. What was the date? Where did they go in? But I think in our thinking about this process, you kind of, in a way, have to let that pinpointing tendency go a little bit. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
Yeah, you helped me. I did let it go. I made my calculation and I let it go. I can't deal with that.
Yeah, because it is overwhelming. You feel that when you go to like a fort in Ghana and they show you the hole where people were kept before they got on the boat. And it's almost too much to think about, you know, how it must feel to be in that hole and then walk through the door of no return and down to the ship. But you, in order to do this work, you have to remember the humanity, but let go of some, it's kind of hard to describe exactly what you're letting go of. It's definitely not the humanity, but you kind of have to let go of the idea that you're going to pinpoint any kind of point of origin where these things happened, because that's the part we won't ever know. So being comfortable with the unknowns, I guess, some of them.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Jody. I think we're going to have to cut it off there. Although this has been a really wonderful conversation and wonderful, maybe not wonderful, devastating and powerful. Everyone, thank you, everyone else for coming, and thanks to our fellow organizers.